confrontations between protesters and police in riot gear. The same anger and outrage that exploded into a chaotic night of looting and violence.
Specifically looked at special weapons and tactics teams, SWAT teams.
Yes.
What did you find out?
Well, we found that SWAT teams were created in the 1960s to deal with these really emergency scenarios that, again, you and I and many others would expect SWAT teams to respond to. And in fact, they're being used routinely for ordinary law enforcement, including searching people's homes, often for pretty small amounts of drugs. And it's important to understand, when there's a search of a person's home, there has been no crime committed necessarily. There's no perpetrator, there's no conviction, there's no crime. It's essentially an investigation. So what we saw is the commonplace use of paramilitary weapons and tactics to conduct investigations in people's homes.
Since 1996, in response to the war on drugs, the Department of Defense transferred $4.3 billion in military equipment to local and state police. After 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security made additional equipment available to local law enforcement through federal funds for terrorism prevention.
The Department of Defense's 1033 program was created by the National Defense Authorization Act of 1997. It is a transfer of excess military equipment to local law enforcement agencies. As of 2014, 8,000 agencies have participated in the reutilization program that has transferred $5.1 billion in military hardware from the Department of Defense to the American law enforcement agencies. The top 3 states with the most law enforcement agencies participating in the 1033 program are Ohio with 514 departments, Illinois with 429 departments, and Texas with 426 departments. Since 2006, the minimum amount of combat gear received by local and state law enforcement has been 432 mine-resistant ambush protected armored vehicles, or MRAPs, 435 other armored road vehicles, 44,900 units of night vision equipment, 533 airplanes and helicopters, and 93,763 .556 and 7.62 millimeter automatic assault rifles. Also, for 2011-2012, 79% of all SWAT raids were to serve a search warrant, 50% of raids were against Black or Latino targets, and 35% of raids were for targets known to be armed or otherwise dangerous.
As with any polarizing issue, the case of police militarization has many pros and cons. Some advantages to an increased aggression and weaponization of police force includes: the police need to be prepared in the face of an increasingly violent and aggressive, not to mention armed, organized crime adversary. The police also showing that they are prepared to defend themselves has the potentiality to diffuse situations when those involved in the disruptance back down when the police force is escalated. Most importantly, is maintaining the safety of these men and women who devote their lives to keeping the peace and keeping us, the citizens, safe. This issue also has many points against it. Some of these arguments include: escalating the severity of the police force has the potential to anger those who are demonstrating further, or to take a nonviolent movement and turn it violent when the people see the willingness to jump to violence by the police force. Some Americans also view the use of force and buying of expensive equipment that's arguably even necessary waste billions of taxpayer dollars that are being poured into programs such as SWAT. In addition, incidents such as the events which occurred at Ferguson recently exemplify the overuse of the police's resources and the abuses of the officers who aren't even qualified to be using the equipment that they have.
In the military, we're trained on something called escalation of force, which basically means the only time that you're really going to point a weapon directly at someone is when you're ready to pull the trigger. And instead of that, we've seen in Ferguson that police are just wandering around with their weapons up at all times, pointing them at people that obviously didn't pose a threat.
In conclusion, since the 1960s, SWAT teams have only grown in use, even in simple searches. The war on drugs has greatly increased funding for local police forces, and 9/11 has only increased it further. Military equipment formerly used in war has been moved to local and state law enforcement at very accessible levels. Most SWAT raids are not used in examples of dangerous operations against armed criminals. There are many points for and against the militarization of police. And finally, instead of simply taking the initiative in increasing the size and severity of our police forces, we should be talking with authorities, making sure that their actions not only coincide with the levels of actual threats, but with what the actual people themselves want.